The wind that night carried more than the salt of the sea. It carried whispers, faint as moth wings, yet heavy as confession, gliding over black waters toward the looming cliffs of the Isle of Fenwick. Lanterns flickered across the harbor, struggling against a storm not yet born, while deep within the ruined abbey a single cry split the stillness. By morning, the villagers awoke to news that traveled faster than gulls on the wind. A guest at the old manor house had been found dead, alone in a locked chamber. A tragedy, perhaps, or something more. For on that same night, the celebrated Belgian detective Hercule Poirot had stepped ashore, summoned by a letter that promised intrigue cloaked in secrecy. The stage was set, a grand manor perched above restless tides, a cast of guests each carrying secrets like hidden daggers, and an island whose stones had soaked centuries of betrayal. Every step here would echo, every silence would accuse, and already the isle whispered his name. If such mysteries compel you, if you long to unravel the coils of lies and shadow with us, then linger in this parlor of suspense. Allow your curiosity to take its place at the table. Subscribe, share, and keep the lamp burning with us, so the investigation may press on unbroken into the darkest corners. Chapter I. The isle and its shadows. The sea was not calm that evening, though no storm yet dared break its fury. It was a restless tide, pressing against the rocks of Fenwick Isle with the persistence of an unspoken question. Across that salt-stung expanse the ferry cut its narrow path, lanterns swinging wildly as though uneasy in their iron frames. Hercule Poirot stood at the prow, his gloved hands folded neatly before him, his posture as immovable as the cliffs looming ever closer. His mustache, that proud emblem of order and control, bristled only slightly in the damp air. He had been summoned, not by chance but by choice, through a letter whose words had carried more urgency than elegance. The isle revealed itself, not as a jewel of the coast, but as a brooding sentinel. Its cliffs were sheer, its beaches narrow, its forests thick with pines that whispered in ceaseless argument with the wind. Above it all, perched upon a rise like a monarch long unwilling to abdicate, stood Blackthorn Manor. Its windows caught the last of the sunset in fleeting glimmers, as though reluctant to acknowledge the night. From the ferry's deck, Poirot regarded it with a gaze sharpened by suspicion. Houses may be built of stone, yet they breathe with the character of those who inhabit them. And this house, vast and shadowed, breathed secrecy. The ferry struck the dock with a groan of timber, and Poirot disembarked with his small valise in hand, his shoes striking the planks with precise rhythm. A single figure awaited him, Inspector Hall of the local constabulary, a man broad of shoulder, but heavy-eyed, as though the island's mysteries had already claimed too many of his nights. His greeting was formal, but beneath it lingered an unease, the unease of one who had called for help, yet felt the sting of wounded pride in admitting the need. Together they set their course toward the waiting carriage, its wheels creaking as it bore them along a narrow lane, where hedges leaned like eavesdroppers. Inside the carriage, Holly spoke little at first. Poirot let the silence breathe, for silence reveals more than hurried words. Eventually the inspector gave voice to the truth that had drawn the Belgian detective across the channel. A death had occurred within Blackthorn Manor violent, though some whispered it was cursed rather than criminal. The victim, Lord Alistair Ferncombe, a scholar of antiquities and master of the estate, had been discovered in his study at dawn, lifeless upon the floor with a shattered glass beside him. The door had been locked from within. No weapon was found. No footprints marred the heavy carpets. And yet, Holly confessed, the man's eyes had been wide in a terror that drink alone could not explain. The carriage rattled on, each turn revealing fragments of the Isle's story. A cluster of cottages where fishermen paused their nets to watch with narrowed eyes. A ruined chapel, its bell long silent, but its towers stubbornly upright. The air thickened with fog as they climbed the hill, until Blackthorn Manor loomed above them in full, its turrets like blackened candles against a bruised sky. Poirot stepped down with a measured grace, noting the cracked steps, the ivy cloying at stone, the faint scent of seaweed that clung even to the tapestries within the great hall. Here wealth had met decay, and neither had triumphed. The household gathered in cautious silence as Poirot was introduced. Lady Evelyn Ferncombe, the widow, carried herself with brittle dignity, her mourning garb impeccable, but her eyes darting as if pursued by unseen fears. Their daughter, Clara, pale and sharp of tongue, regarded Poirot with youthful disdain, thinly veiling her curiosity. Among the guests stranded by the Isle's isolation stood Dr. Ashworth, a physician of solemn bearing, Mr. Lionel Crane, a financier whose every movement seemed calculated, and Miss Beatrice Lorne, a novelist, her gaze sharp as quills dipped in ink. Servants lingered at the edges, their whispers hushed but not silenced, while the butler, old Maddox, announced Poirot's presence with a voice both steady and weary. Poirot allowed himself a slow survey, his little gray cells already quickening at the tableau. Each face wore a mask, but masks tremble when death intrudes upon civility. In the drawing-room, where the fire hissed faintly against damp logs, Inspector Hall laid the matter before all assembled. Lord Ferncombe, he declared, had died between the hours of midnight and 2, the locked door ensuring none had entered nor left. And yet, he said, such impossibility was but an illusion. Someone in this very house carried knowledge they dared not speak. Poirot listened, not to Hale's words, but to the murmurs beneath them, the quick intake of Lady Evelyn's breath, the nervous cough of Crane, the way Miss Lorne's eyes flickered toward Clara, as if to measure her reaction. He heard the scrape of a chair leg across the floor, the faint chiming of a clock that seemed to mock the inspector's certainty. And then, when silence threatened to consume the room entirely, Poirot spoke in his measured, melodic tone. "Messieurs at Madame, the Isle whispers, does it not? It tells of secrets buried beneath waves and walls alike. But secrets, no matter how well guarded, leave behind their little traces. And it is for the little traces that Hercule Poirot has come." The fire crackled, and the faces before him stiffened in the glow. Beyond the windows, the sea roared like distant applause for a play whose first act had just begun. Poirot did not sleep upon arrival, nor did he ask for tea, though Maddox the butler offered both with mechanical courtesy. He requested instead to be taken at once to the study where Lord Ferncombe had met his death. Lady Evelyn hesitated, her gloved hands tightening upon each other as though the very idea of entering that room pressed upon her nerves. But Poirot, with a small bow and a soft insistence, made it clear that the truth did not wait for morning to subside. And so it was Maddox, steady in his age, who lifted a lamp and led Poirot and Inspector Hall through the hushed corridors of Blackthorn Manor, The manners passages whispered with every step, their carpets warm but soft enough to muffle secrets. Candles guttered in iron sconces, shadows slanting across portraits, whose painted eyes seemed to follow intruders with silent judgment. Poirot's gaze lingered on details others overlooked, the faint scratches on a brass handle, the dust disturbed near a stair rail, the hurried polish upon one section of floor, but not the next. He said nothing, but his mustache twitched in quiet satisfaction, as though each observation was tucked neatly into the vault of his mind. At last, Maddox halted before a heavy oak door, its brass lock gleaming faintly. "The study, monsieur," he murmured, and stepped aside. Hawley produced a key from his coat and unlocked the door, which groaned open like a reluctant witness. The air within was heavy, scented with tobacco smoke and something metallic beneath it, faint but undeniable, like rust carried on a damp wind. Poirot paused on the threshold, eyes narrowing. The room itself bore the grandeur of scholarship, shelves burdened with leather-bound volumes, a vast globe in one corner, maps pinned with neat precision upon the walls. A desk of dark walnut dominated the center, papers strewn across it in hurried disarray. The chair behind it had toppled, one leg splintered upon the rug, and there, still faintly stained, though the body had been removed, was the outline where Lord Ferncombe had fallen. The broken glass lay nearby, its shards gathered but not removed, as though evidence must remain untouched until properly examined. Poirot bent low, his fingers tracing the carpet fibers without disturbing them, his nose close enough to catch the lingering trace of spilled brandy. Yet he frowned. The scent was sharp, but not overwhelming. He looked toward the desk and found a decanter still half full, its stopper placed carelessly aside. He noted, too, the faint scorch of burnt paper in the grate, fragments of handwriting curling black at their edges. A letter destroyed in haste, yet not completely. Poirot plucked one fragment delicately with his tweezers, the letters Ing Isle, still legible, the rest lost to flame. "Curious," he murmured. A fire lit, a letter half burned, and yet the brandy glass shattered. Yes, but not wholly emptied. One asks oneself, was it the drink, or was it the hand that carried it? Inspector Hong shifted uneasily. The doctor believes his heart gave out. Or perhaps, he hesitated, perhaps some ancient curse of the Abbey. Lord Ferncombe was obsessed with his studies there. Poirot turned, his dark eyes gleaming in the lamplight. "Mon cher, it is not the habit of curses to lock doors behind them." As they examined the chamber further, subtle oddities revealed themselves like shy confessions. A set of muddy footprints upon the balcony stone, faint yet distinct, though the rain had been light that night. A clock upon the mantel stopped at 12 minutes past 1. A cigar stub in the ashtray, though none present admitted to smoking such a brand. Each clue lay silent, waiting for the mind precise enough to bind them together. When Poirot stepped back into the corridor, the air seemed fresher, though no less laden with whispers. The servants lingered there, their faces pale, their eyes darting like fish in shallow waters. Poirot paused before them, his voice calm but firm. "You are afraid, Mees Amos, but fear is a poor companion in a house where truth must be our only guide. Come, tell me, what was heard in the night?" There was hesitation, until finally a maid named Rose, her hands trembling, spoke in a voice no louder than the rustle of silk. She had heard footsteps, she said, after the clocks struck midnight. Not one pair, but two, pacing back and forth beyond her chamber door. She had thought it the Lord himself, restless as always. But then she heard the sound of a low argument, a man's voice and a woman's, sharp and quick, though she could not make out the words. Then silence. Silence broken only by the shattering of glass. Poirot inclined his head gravely. "Merci, mademoiselle. You have given us a thread, and with a thread even the most tangled web may yet be undone." The servants exchanged anxious glances, and Poirot continued down the corridor, his mind alive with possibilities. The isle, he thought, was not cursed, but complicit. Its shadows did not merely conceal, they conspired. And within those shadows someone had walked freely while others dreamed, carrying both motive and means close to the heart. He knew, as surely as he had felt the sea's unrest upon the ferry, that the true storm was yet to break. The supper bell rang through the halls of Blackthorn Manor with a solemn chime, as though it summoned not guests to a meal but witnesses to a tribunal. Poirot, ever punctual, arrived in the dining hall alongside Inspector Halley, their entrance watched with a mixture of curiosity and unease. The long oak table stretched beneath the weight of silver platters and polished goblets, the meal a grand show of civility that no appetite truly matched. The candles along the table's length burned high, their flames bending in unseen draughts, throwing long shadows across the paneled walls. Above them, ancestral portraits surveyed the scene, painted eyes glinting with the kind of secrets only silence preserves. Lady Evelyn presided at the head of the table, her black silk gown catching the light in somber ripples. Though her manner remained composed, her hand lingered too long on her wine-glass, as if it were a talisman against despair. Clara, her daughter, sat opposite Poirot, her youth sharpened by disdain. She toyed with her fork, tapping it against her plate with a rhythm that grated upon the ears, her gaze flicking across the room with restless defiance. Beside her sat Lionel Crane, the financier, his thin smile never warming his eyes, his voice too smooth, as though every word had already been rehearsed. Dr. Ashworth, heavy-shouldered and weary, cut his meat with grim deliberation, his silence as deliberate as his appetite. Miss Beatrice Lorne, the novelist, watched everything with keen, calculating interest, the corner of her mouth twitching each time an unguarded phrase slipped across the table. Poirot ate sparingly, his attention fixed not upon the food, but upon the drama playing itself between courses. He noted how Lady Evelyn's glance lingered on Crane when the subject of debts arose, how Clara bristled when Miss Lorne spoke of youth wasted on melancholy, and how Dr. Ashworth avoided the widow's gaze entirely, as though an invisible chasm yawned between them. Every gesture, every hesitation was a clue, and though the silence of Lord Ferncome's locked chamber still pressed upon them all, the silence at this table proved even more telling. At length, Poirot dabbed his lips with his napkin and, in a voice that cut gently through the tension, addressed the company. "It is always the custom, is it not, that when tragedy strikes, those who remain gather together to share the meal? Yet I observe that appetite is most unwilling tonight. Perhaps then conversation will serve us better than food." A murmur rippled down the table. Miss Lorne seized the moment, her novelist's flair too eager for silence. She leaned forward, her voice dripping with drama. "They say, Monsieur Poirot, that the Abbey ruins curse this family, that those who disturb its stones are fated for untimely ends. Lord Ferncombe was there only days ago, digging among graves for relics best left buried. Perhaps it was no man's hand that claimed him, but the isle itself." Inspector Hall stiffened, muttering about superstition. Poirot, however, smiled thinly. "Mademoiselle, you tell a tale most poetic. Yet tell me, do curses stop clocks at precisely 12 minutes past 1? Do they leave the scent of cigar smoke where no cigar is lit?" Silence fell once more, broken only by Clara's sharp laugh, brittle and defiant. "So you mean to say one of us did it? That my father was murdered in his own home?" "Absurd." Poirot tilted his head, eyes glinting. "Mademoiselle, one does not speak of absurdity in the face of death. One speaks only of possibility. And possibility, I assure you, sits at this very table." The words struck like flint against stone. Lady Evelyn lowered her glass, her hand trembling faintly. Crane shifted in his seat, smoothing his tie with studied calm. Dr. Ashworth cleared his throat, as though to speak, then thought better of it. The servants moved quietly about the edges of the room, their eyes downcast, yet their ears most alert. Then, quite suddenly, the first red herring revealed itself. Maddox, the butler, announced that one of the household maids had discovered a bloodied handkerchief in the laundry. The cloth, delicate and embroidered, bore the initials B.L. Gasps rose around the table, and all eyes fell upon Beatrice Lorne. She did not shrink beneath them. Rather, she leaned back in her chair with a smile, her voice calm but sharp. "So quick to suspect, are we? Yet might I remind you, Inspector, that initials are but common things, and blood, once shed, clings to many hands." Poirot regarded her with cool composure, his mustache twitching faintly. "Indeed, mademoiselle, a clue most dramatic, most convenient. Perhaps too convenient, n'est-ce pas?" The room's tension tightened like a noose, each guest measuring the other in the candlelight. For Poirot, the meal had given him more than sustenance. It had revealed rivalries, whispered debts, and a deliberate distraction masquerading as evidence. And when at last the company rose from the table, Poirot lingered at his place, his eyes distant yet precise, as though he listened not to the clatter of dishes, but to the whispers of the isle itself. The night, he knew, would not pass quietly. The storm that had threatened since dusk finally announced itself with a hollow groan across the sea, the waves crashing against Phoenix cliffs with a violence that rattled the window panes of Blackthorn Manor. Rain began in hesitant taps, then in fierce drumming, a rhythm that filled every corridor with the reminder that escape from the isle was now impossible. The ferry would not return until the sea relented, and the guests, whether innocent or guilty, were sealed within these walls until dawn. Poirot withdrew from the dining hall to the smoking room, though he neither smoked nor drank. He preferred the quiet there, the ticking of a clock on the mantel, the scent of aged leather rising from armchairs that had witnessed decades of confidences and quarrels. Inspector Hall joined him briefly, the storm reflected in his weary eyes. "You'll forgive me, Poirot," he muttered, "but I can't see how this case isn't headed toward a dead end. Locked doors, no weapon, no footprints worth naming. And now this handkerchief nonsense lord, the village will be whispering that the devil himself walked the halls. Poirot folded his hands, his gaze steady. Mon ami, you think of the large things, always the large. The weapon, the door, the footprints. But it is the small, the delicate, the overlooked detail that betrays the truth. It is in the way a glass shatters, the angle of a chair upon the carpet, the scorch of a paper half destroyed. These things they speak when others remain silent. He tapped one finger against the arm of his chair. And tonight I listen not only to the house, but to the storm, for storms unsettle the guilty heart. As if on cue, a door slammed somewhere down the corridor, the echo startling in its violence. Poirot rose, adjusting his bow tie, and stepped into the hall. The lamps flickered with each gust that rattled the manor's bones. The portraits along the walls seemed alive in the shifting light, their painted ancestors smirking as though they alone knew the truth. Poirot walked slowly, his polished shoes clicking on the parquet, each sound swallowed by the house's vast silence. He found Clara near the library, her face pale against the shadows, her eyes wide as though caught in some forbidden act. She started when she saw him, pressing a book quickly to her chest. "I couldn't sleep," she stammered, though it was far too early for any decent soul to have sought bed. Poirot bowed slightly, his tone soft. "Of course, mademoiselle. But tell me, is it books you seek or escape?" Her lips parted, then tightened. "You think I had something to do with it?" "You all do. But I hated this place, not my father. Do you understand? I wanted to leave. He would never have allowed it." Her words tumbled too quickly, too defensively. Poirot did not answer. He merely inclined his head, his silence more probing than accusation. Clara hurried past him, vanishing into the stairwell as the thunder rolled once more. Poirot remained in the library, where the fire burned low and the shelves leaned under centuries of collected thought. He let his fingers drift across the spines, his eyes catching on volumes marked with Lord Ferncomb's seal. Ancient histories of the Abbey, transcriptions of old rituals, treatises on relics and curses. The victim's mind had been consumed not merely by wealth or land, but by an obsession with what lay beneath stone and soil. Poirot retrieved a journal from the desk, its cover worn by constant handling. The ink within spoke of discoveries, of unearthed artifacts, of warnings ignored. One passage, marked hastily in the margin, read, "The Isle whispers. Do not trust the voices in the night." Poirot closed the book with deliberate care, his mind arranging the puzzle like a chessboard. The Isle whispered indeed, but not with curses. With people, with motives, with lies. And as the wind howled against the manor's glass, he felt it again, the storm outside and the storm within, each growing, each bound to break in its time. Returning to his chamber at last, Poirot paused at the window. The abbey ruins loomed in the distance, their arches skeletal against the lightning. For one fleeting moment, he thought he saw a figure moving there, cloaked and bent against the rain. A trick of light, perhaps, or a messenger of truths not yet revealed. Poirot watched until the darkness consumed it again, then closed the shutters with a decisive snap. In the stillness that followed, he whispered to himself, "It begins." The Isle does not whisper, only it conspires. And with that, The first night on Fenwick drew toward its uneasy end. Each guest bound to dreams restless with guilt, fear, or anticipation of discovery. Chapter 2. The guests and their masks morning came reluctantly to Fenwick Isle, the storm having spent its rage, but leaving behind a sky the color of tarnished silver. Blackthorn Manor stirred to life with the hushed sounds of servants setting fires and polishing silver, their movements carrying the solemnity of ritual rather than routine. The air was damp, heavy with the mingled scents of sea and ash, as though the isle itself had not yet forgiven the night. Poirot descended the great staircase with his usual precision, his patent leather shoes clicking upon the marble as though marking the tempo of an investigation not yet begun in earnest. The guests assembled in the breakfast room with the strange civility of people bound together by misfortune. Lady Evelyn sat at the head of the table, her widow's veil now raised, but her grief still sharp about her like a blade. She poured tea with hands that trembled only slightly, though her eyes betrayed a restless vigilance, darting from guest to guest as though each might reveal guilt with a careless glance. Clara sat once more across from Poirot, her youth at odds with the bitterness already etched into her features. She toyed with marmalade she did not eat, her restless energy more revealing than any confession. Lionel Crane entered late, adjusting his cuffs as though the delay were deliberate, a performance meant to remind others of his self-importance. He offered apologies too smooth to be sincere, and took his seat with the air of a man both observing and concealing. Beside him, Miss Beatrice Lorne arranged her napkin with meticulous care, her novelist's eye never idle, her gaze lingering upon each participant as though already drafting their roles upon her private page. Dr. Ashworth, silent as before, devoured his breakfast with the grim focus of a man who believed chewing to be a matter of survival rather than pleasure. And in the corner, almost forgotten yet watching all, Maddox poured coffee with the dignity of one who had served generations and seen too much to startle easily. Poirot allowed conversation to drift, offering only small remarks, his true attention devoted to the subtleties that swam beneath. A sigh too deep, a glance too quick, the hesitation before a spoon met the cup, such gestures revealed more than declarations. And yet the surface civility held firm until Inspector Howell entered, his presence carrying the unspoken reminder of the body lying in the chapel below stairs. "If you please," he said gruffly, "Monsieur Poirot will begin his inquiries this morning. We'll speak with each of you in turn." At this the masks slipped ever so slightly. Clara rolled her eyes, feigning disdain, but betraying nerves with her quickened breath. Lady Evelyn pressed her lips thin, her composure cracking at the edges. Crane straightened his tie once more, a gesture that betrayed the fragility beneath his confidence. Miss Lorne, however, smiled faintly, almost hungrily, as though she relished the theatre of it all. Poirot rose, bowing with courtesy. "Mesdames et messieurs, it is not accusation that awaits you, only the gentle search for truth. You will permit me to be thorough, yes? For murder, it does not thrive in vagueness. It thrives in detail." His words, spoken softly, nevertheless struck like hammer blows against the fragile veneer of the room. When breakfast ended, Poirot began his rounds, requesting the company of each guest in the smaller drawing-room, a place intimate enough to unsettle. Lady Evelyn was first, and in the lamplight her beauty, though weathered by grief, still clung to her like a shadow reluctant to leave. She insisted upon her innocence, of course, her voice breaking only when she spoke of her late husband's obsessions with the abbey. Yet Poirot noticed how her fingers twisted her handkerchief, how she faltered when asked about debts whispered in the village. Debts Lionel Crane was rumored to have pressed with merciless calculation. Poirot listened, not judging, merely noting, before sending her gently on her way. Next came Clara, her youthful bravado faltering beneath Poirot's gaze. She spoke of her father's cruelty, of a life caged within the manor's walls, of dreams denied and suitors dismissed. She declared her hatred for the isle itself, but when Poirot pressed, asking where she had been at the hour of one, her eyes flickered. She claimed she had been in her chamber, yet her voice quivered at the edges, a thin thread stretched to breaking. Poirot said nothing, but in his mind the little gray cells hummed. And so the masks began to shift, each revealing more than they concealed. The isle was not only a place of cliffs and ruins, but of secrets festering within those who walked its halls. Poirot knew the truth would not emerge in grand confessions, but in these small fractures, in the way grief, pride, and guilt warred behind carefully composed faces. By midday the detective understood that this case would not be solved by logic alone, but by patience. Each guest was a chapter, each alibi a page half burned, and it was his task to read not what was written, but what was missing. The drawing room had grown close by the time Lionel Crane entered, his cologne trailing ahead of him like a calling card, sharp and assertive. He moved with the air of a man accustomed to command, yet Poirot's practised eye discerned the stiffness in his gait, the tautness at his jaw. Crane bowed faintly, then settled into the chair opposite, one leg crossing the other in calculated ease. "You will forgive the delay, monsieur," he said, smoothing a crease that did not exist on his cuff. "The morning air here is damp, not conducive to good spirits." Poirot's mustache twitched in faint amusement. "Ah, but monsieur, the spirits, they do not reside in the weather. They reside here." He tapped his temple lightly. "And sometimes in the conscience." Crane's smile faltered, but quickly reassembled itself. He answered Poirot's questions with polished brevity, each reply clipped as though rehearsed before a mirror. He admitted, under Poirot's gentle pressing, that Lord Ferncombe had indeed been in debt. Investments gone sour, ships delayed, ventures crumbled beneath bad fortune. Crane himself, as financier and adviser, held much of the lord's accounts in his hands. "Business, Monsieur Poirot," Crane declared, his voice firm. "Nothing more sinister than numbers on a page. Men of intellect should not gamble with matters they cannot grasp." "Numbers," Poirot replied softly, "have the habit of exposing truths men would rather not reveal. And money, monsieur, it is like the tide, it always leaves behind a mark." Crane's gaze hardened for a moment, then drifted away, betraying the faintest unease. He insisted he had retired early the night of the murder, his valet ready to swear it. Yet Poirot noticed how his fingers tapped against the chair arm, a rhythm betraying nerves out of harmony with his words. When Crane departed, Miss Beatrice Lorne entered almost eagerly, her eyes alight as though she relished being cast in the scene of a mystery. She sat forward, her chin resting upon one hand, the pose as deliberate as her smile. "Such an atmosphere," she said, her voice low and theatrical. Storms outside, whispers within, the great detective among us. One could scarcely script it better. Poirot inclined his head. Mademoiselle, you write fiction, yes? And in fiction, the truth is always clearer than in life. But here, his eyes fixed upon hers, here I ask for truth without the embroidery. She laughed lightly, but the laughter rang hollow, echoing a little too long in the paneled room. When pressed, she admitted to walking the corridors after midnight, restless with thought, her mind too quick to permit sleep. She claimed she had heard nothing but the wind. Yet Poirot observed the faintest stain of ink upon her fingers, a sign of recent writing. He wondered, had she been writing alibis as much as stories? Then came the matter of the bloodied handkerchief, embroidered with her initials. She leaned back, her smile sharpening into defiance. A convenient clue, don't you think? Far too convenient. Do you imagine, monsieur, that I would leave behind so theatrical a trail? No. Someone wishes me suspected. And that, perhaps, is the truest story of all. Poirot did not argue. He merely regarded her in silence, his gaze unblinking, until her poise wavered, and she glanced aside. He knew her type well, the observer who thinks herself beyond suspicion, and yet who delights too much in the drama of suspicion itself. By the time she departed, Poirot felt the house's air heavier, as though it carried not just salt and storm, but the weight of unseen glances. In the corridor he encountered Rose, the trembling maid who had spoken the night before. She curtsied quickly, her eyes wide. Poirot's voice softened. Mademoiselle, the servants, they hear all that others hope to hide. Tell me what whispers. Move among you? Rose bit her lip, glancing toward the stairwell, as though the shadows themselves might punish her words. They say Lady Evelyn quarrelled with his lordship not 3 nights past. About money, monsieur. About the abbey. She begged him to stop his digging, to stop wasting the estate. And she hesitated, her voice trembling. Some say she feared what he might discover, that some things were meant never to be unearthed. Poirot thanked her with a small bow, leaving her to scurry away down the passage. He lingered a moment, listening to the hush of the house, the way its silence seemed to throb like a pulse beneath the floorboards. Each account contradicted another, each alibi frayed at its edges. Yet within these contradictions, Poirot felt the shape of truth beginning to form, like a figure emerging slowly from mist. The guests wore masks, yes, but masks slip, and in their slipping lay the first glimpse of the face beneath. Dr. Ashworth arrived with reluctance, his broad frame filling the doorway as though he hoped sheer presence might shield him from inquiry. He settled into the chair with a heaviness that belonged not only to his body, but to his spirit, his eyes fixed on the rug rather than on Poirot. The physician was a man whose silence spoke loudly, and Poirot, who understood silence better than most, allowed it to linger before speaking. "Doctor," he began gently, "it is not the habit of Hercule Poirot to trouble the men of science. Yet you were the first to see Lord Ferncombe when life had departed him, were you not?" Ashworth shifted, his jaw tightening. "I was summoned at dawn. Maddox found him. When I arrived, his lordship was beyond help. Heart failure seemed the most likely cause, though he hesitated, and in that hesitation Poirot leaned forward, his eyes keen. Though, doctor?" Ashworth exhaled slowly, his hands clasping together. "Though his eyes?" I've seen death in many forms, illness, accident, age, but not terror like that. Not as though he had glimpsed something unbearable. I cannot name it, but I will not forget it. Poirot regarded him steadily. And you, doctor, where were you when the clock struck one? The answer came too swiftly. In my chamber, asleep. A beat of silence followed, then the physician added, alone. His tone carried the weary certainty of a man who knew alibis uncorroborated or alibis distrusted. Poirot made a small note in his mind, though his face betrayed nothing. When Ashworth departed, Maddox entered with the dignity of habit, his silver hair gleaming in the lamplight. He bowed deeply before taking his seat, his voice calm, but edged with fatigue. Monsieur Poirot, I have served this family near 50 years. I would see no harm come to it, not in my time. Poirot inclined his head. Then you will help me. You were the first to find him, yes? Tell me what you saw. The butler's eyes darkened, his gaze turning inward. I brought in the morning tray. The door was locked. I knocked. No answer. I fetched the key and opened it. He was there, on the floor. The glass shattered beside him. I sent for the doctor at once. He paused, swallowing. I knew then the house would never be the same. Poirot studied him closely. And yet, monsieur, the door was locked. Who else holds a key? Maddox's lips pressed thin. His lordship, myself, Lady Evelyn, and the steward, though he left the island 2 months ago. A pause followed, filled only by the ticking of the clock. Poirot let silence work its art until Maddox, unprompted, continued. There is something more. In the chapel below, where they've laid him for the time being, I saw something last night. A candle burned at the altar, though no one lit it. And on the floor beside the bier there were footprints, damp as though someone had come in from the rain. Poirot's eyes sharpened. You are certain? As certain as my own breath. But when I returned this morning, the floor was clean, as though scrubbed. Maddox's voice dropped, weighted with dread. The servants whisper of curses. I tell them curses are nonsense. But I have served this house long enough to know. There are things men will do in the dark that look very much like curses in the light. Poirot rose, placing a hand lightly upon the butler's arm. Merci, monsieur. You have given me truth disguised as superstition. That is most valuable. When Maddox departed, Poirot lingered alone in the drawing-room. The fragments of testimony swirled together like pieces of broken glass, debts, quarrels, restlessness, footsteps in the night, a candle in the chapel. Each by itself was nothing, but together they gleamed with the promise of a pattern. Poirot knew he must tread carefully. For here, in this manner, truth and illusion danced so closely that to follow one too swiftly was to risk mistaking it for the other. And beyond the windows the abbey loomed through thinning mist, its ruins patient, as though waiting for the living to betray themselves before its ancient stones. The chapel lay in the oldest wing of Blackthorn Manor, a stone chamber whose walls had absorbed centuries of prayer and despair alike. Poirot descended the steps with deliberate care, each footfall echoing faintly in the still air. The heavy door yielded with a groan, and at once he was met by the mingled scents of candle wax, damp stone, and the faint metallic tang of death. The chamber was dim, lit only by shafts of pale morning light that pierced narrow windows high above, their glass mottled with age. At the center lay Lord Ferncomb's body upon a bier, draped in black cloth, the features of his face obscured but his form unmistakable. The silence pressed close, broken only by the faint drip of water from some unseen fissure in the ceiling. Poirot stood still for a long moment, bowing his head slightly, as though acknowledging the man not as victim but as host, for even in death the Lord still commanded the house. Then his eyes sharpened. He moved across the flagstones, his polished shoes clicking softly, his gaze sweeping the floor. Maddox had spoken of footprints, and though the surface had been scrubbed, Poirot's keen eye caught what others had missed. A faint smear of mud clung to the seam of a flagstone, too stubborn for a careless cloth. Kneeling, he touched it delicately with his gloved finger, bringing it close enough to see the dark grit embedded within. Not merely soil, but clay not common to the manor's gardens, but to the abbey grounds beyond. He rose, his gaze falling upon the altar. A candle had indeed been burned recently, the wax pooled unevenly, hardened in ridges that spoke of hasty lighting and hurried extinguishing. Poirot tilted his head, considering. A candle lit in the night, footprints damp from the rain, and the body of Lord Ferncombe, lying watchful even in death. Who had come here, and why? To pay respects or to ensure silence. He circled the bier, noting the angle of the cloth, the neatness of its drape. Yet near the shoulder the fabric bore a faint crease, as though lifted and replaced. Poirot's eyes narrowed. He lifted it gently, revealing nothing amiss at first glance, until he saw the edge of the victim's shirt cuff, stained not only with brandy, but with something darker, a faint trace of ash. Ash that did not come from tobacco alone. At that moment, the door creaked. Poirot turned to see Clara standing at the threshold, her hair loose, her eyes wide. I shouldn't be here," she whispered. Poirot stepped toward her, his voice calm but pointed. "Yet here you are, mademoiselle. Why?" She clutched the door frame, her voice trembling. "I wanted to see him, to see if it was true. They all say he was cursed, but I needed to know if it looked like murder." Her gaze darted to the bier, then away. "I hated him, yes, but I didn't wish him dead." Poirot regarded her in silence, noting the way her hands twisted in her skirts, the tremor of her breath. He believed her grief was real, but grief and guilt were close cousins, each borrowing the other's disguise. He took her hand gently, guiding her back toward the corridor. "Mademoiselle, the dead, they do not accuse. It is the living who do that. Come, leave him his rest." As the door closed, Poirot glanced once more at the bier, his mind alive with possibilities. The candle, the footprints, the ash-stained cuff-all pointed not to superstition, but to deliberate intrusion. Someone had visited the body, not for mourning, but for concealment. And concealment was itself a confession. The chapel, once meant for solace, had become another crime scene. And in its silence, Poirot heard not prayers but lies. Chapter 3. Red herrings in the parlor of Blackthorn Manor, became the stage upon which suspicion was rehearsed, repeated, and revised. By midday the storm had dwindled to a mournful drizzle, and the guests gathered by the fire with a reluctance that betrayed their unease. The air was thick with pipe smoke and murmurs, each word weighed and measured, as though any slip might cost more than reputation. Poirot entered quietly, his small frame commanding more gravity than the tallest of men, and took his place by the mantelpiece, where the fire hissed and cracked as if eager to echo his observations. The constable from the village, summoned by Inspector Halley, stood near the door, his uniform damp from the mist outside. He held his notebook clumsily, his pencil hovering, as though words themselves might betray him. The guests eyed him with a mixture of disdain and anxiety, for no one wished their lives scribbled in a stranger's record. Poirot clasped his hands, his voice cutting gently through the mutter. Messieurs et mesdames, when truth is hidden, rumor rushes to take its place. It is therefore in this room, with us all together, that I would hear your accounts. Not accusations, no, but alibis. And so the accounts began. Clara spoke first, her voice sharpened by defiance. She claimed she had spent the night sleepless, pacing her chamber until exhaustion claimed her near dawn. Yet Poirot recalled the flicker of her eyes in the chapel, the tremor in her voice. He did not press, not yet. Lionel Crane followed, his tone clipped, his gaze unwavering. He insisted he had retired early, his valet able to attest. Yet Poirot noted the faint twitch of Crane's jaw when Lady Evelyn shifted in her chair, as though the mention of his alibi was itself a rebuke. Lady Evelyn's statement was delivered with dignity, her words measured, her sorrow evident. She had read late into the night, she said, her maid bringing her tea at 11:30, but she faltered when Poirot asked which book had occupied her hours. Her answer, a novel, one of Beatrice's, came too quickly, too neatly rehearsed. Beatrice Lorne leaned forward, her eyes alight, her smile almost taunting. She admitted to her midnight wanderings, but dismissed them as harmless eccentricity. Writers keep strange hours, monsieur. We live in shadows where others dream. Her tone was theatrical, her words crafted, but Poirot observed the way she stiffened when Halley mentioned the handkerchief. Her denial was convincing, perhaps too convincing, as though she had practiced the line before her mirror. Dr. Ashworth, when pressed, repeated his earlier statement of solitude, his voice low, his eyes heavy. But Poirot saw his hands tremble when he lifted his glass of water, as though carrying not thirst, but burden, and then, like smoke curling from unseen fire, contradictions began to surface. A maid whispered that she had heard voices near the study past midnight, though the lady of the house swore she had been alone in her room. Crane's valet confirmed his master's early retirement, but admitted under pressure that he had left Crane's chamber before one. And Maddox, steady though he was, faltered when asked who else had keys to the study. Only his lordship, Lady Evelyn, myself. His paws stretched thin, and perhaps the steward, though he is long gone. Poirot allowed silence to linger, watching as each face stiffened beneath the weight of doubt. Then he stepped forward, lifting the small fragment of letter he had salvaged from the grate. "Ing Isle," he read softly. "This is what remained of a message, half destroyed. To whom was it written, and why was it burned?" That, Mies Amos, is what troubles Hercule Poirot. A murmur rippled. Evening descended once more, drawing a shroud of fog across the isle so dense that even the lamps of the village below flickered dimly, as if strangled by the mist. Inside Blackthorn Manor, however, the parlor glowed with firelight, its warmth doing little to soften the chill of unease. Poirot had requested the company gather again, and though none voiced objection, their reluctance was visible in every careful movement, every guarded glance. He began with politeness. pouring himself a measure of tea with delicate precision, stirring only once before setting the spoon neatly aside. Then he looked at them, each in turn, his eyes steady, his mustache bristling slightly in the glow. "It is curious," he said softly, "how truth and lie they sit so close together. One must only touch them to hear which rings hollow." His first touch was directed toward Lady Evelyn. "Madame, you said last night you read until near the stroke of midnight. A novel, was it not? Written by Mademoiselle Lorne." The widow inclined her head, though her eyes shifted toward Beatrice for the briefest moment. "Yes, monsieur. Her latest work. I found it distracting." Poirot leaned forward slightly. "And yet, when I looked in the library this morning, the book remained upon the shelf, its pages uncut. Forgive me, madame, but one does not read a book without opening it." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the crackle of fire. Lady Evelyn's lips pressed thin, her cheeks pale. She did not answer, and Poirot, satisfied with her silence, let the revelation linger like perfume none could ignore. Next, his gaze shifted to Lionel Crane. "Monsieur, your valet insists you retired early, and yet he left you before the hour of 1. How convenient, n'est-ce pas, that the moment of death is the very moment when you were alone." Crane bristled, his hands curling into fists upon the armrests. "Are we to be condemned for solitude?" "For God's sake, Poirot, I was in my bed. If I had wished to do the deed, would I not have found a more discreet method? A financier does not sully his hands with broken glasses." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Ah, but money, monsieur, it soils far deeper than brandy. And debts, they are motive enough to draw blood." Crane's jaw tightened, his protest dying in his throat. He looked instead toward Lady Evelyn, and though neither spoke, the air between them thickened with some unspoken history. Poirot allowed the tension to swell, before turning to Miss Lorne. "And you, mademoiselle, who walk by night and leave behind the handkerchief marked with your name. Too obvious, too clumsy for one of your wit. Unless, of course, you wished to be suspected, to play the role of the accused." Beatrice smiled faintly, her pen already poised above her notebook. "Suspicion is a delicious thing, Monsieur Poirot, but to play accused requires an accuser, and you, sir, seem reluctant to declare me guilty outright." Poirot bowed his head slightly, his smile polite but unreadable. "Because, mademoiselle, I prefer my stories to end with truth, not theater." The fire flared suddenly, sending sparks upward, and in that sharp light Poirot saw Clara's face. Pale, strained, her eyes darting from one guest to the next, her hands gripping her chair until her knuckles whitened. "You're wasting time," she said abruptly, her voice cracking. "You speak of books and debts and handkerchiefs, but none of it matters. He's dead. Isn't that enough?" Poirot's gaze softened, but did not waver. "Mademoiselle, grief does not excuse falsehood. You say you remained in your chamber, yet the maid heard footsteps, voices. Was it yours she heard? Or your mother's? Or perhaps another entirely?" Clara's lips parted, but no words came. She pushed her chair back sharply, the legs scraping against the floor, and fled the parlor before anyone could stop her. The door slammed behind her, the echo reverberating through the manor. Poirot remained still, watching the faces left behind. Each revealed something: Lady Evelyn's anguish, Crane's simmering anger, Lorne's hungry fascination, Ashworth's weary dread. And though Clara's flight appeared dramatic, Poirot knew better. A red herring, perhaps, yet red herrings pointed to truths deeper hidden. The constable muttered about fetching her, but Poirot raised a hand. "None, let her be. The guilty, they cannot run from themselves. In her absence, perhaps the masks of others will slip." Outside, the rain struck harder against the glass, a steady percussion that mirrored the quickened heartbeats within. Poirot stirred his tea once more, calmly, methodically, and looked into the fire. The isle whispers still, and soon, Mies Amos, it will shout. The hour crept past 9, when the house realized Clara had not returned. At first it was thought she had retreated to her chamber in defiance. Her door closed upon the household as surely as upon their suspicions. But when Maddox went to fetch her, he found the room empty, the bed untouched, the window ajar with rain dripping in from the sill. The discovery rippled through Blackthorn Manor like the tolling of a bell, summoning dread with each strike. Lady Evelyn rose at once, her composure shattered, her cry echoing in the corridor. Lionel Crane muttered darkly about hysterics. Beatrice Lorne scribbled furiously in her notebook, her eyes alight with a novelist thrill, thinly disguised as concern. Dr. Ashworth pressed a hand to his brow, his silence heavier than words. Poirot, however, remained calm, his gaze fixed upon the window. He traced the rain-slicked ledge with his eyes, noting the absence of footprints on the sodden ground below. No, Clara had not climbed out into the storm. She had walked, quite deliberately, through the halls unseen or unremarked upon. He turned to Maddox, his voice measured. "The servants, they move quietly, yes? Ask them, monsieur. Ask what they—" Crane stiffened, his voice hard. "I manage affairs, Poirot. That was my duty to Lord Ferncombe, and it may yet be to Lady Evelyn. What Clara chooses to do in her hysteria is not my responsibility." Poirot stepped closer, the lamplight catching his eyes with an almost surgical precision. "Ah, but it is convenient, n'est-ce pas? The daughter who despises her father vanishes, leaving only a scrap of silk, while you remain surrounded by papers no one else can read. And yet it is too convenient." Crane's face darkened. "Are you accusing me of plotting her disappearance?" Poirot shook his head slowly. "Non, monsieur. I am accusing you of knowing more than you say. You press debts, you whisper bargains, you weave yourself into the affairs of this family until no thread may be pulled without unraveling you as well. Tell me, was it not you who met a veiled woman at the Abbey ruins last week?" For the first time, Crane faltered. His hand twitched toward the brandy, then fell back to the ledger as though to anchor himself. I met no one. Idle village gossip." Poirot's mustache twitched in amusement. "Gossip, monsieur, is like smoke. It is only visible when there is fire." Crane said nothing, but his silence was answer enough. Poirot let it linger before withdrawing, his small frame casting a long shadow across the threshold. He left Crane with his papers, but in his mind the financier's mask had cracked. Yet Crane was not the only mask slipping. When Poirot returned to the parlor, he found Lady Evelyn waiting by the hearth, her veil discarded, her face pale and unguarded. She turned at once, her voice trembling. "Monsieur Poirot, you must find her. Clara is reckless, but she is no liar. She knows something. She said as much to me yesterday. She said my husband was hiding more than debts, more than relics. She feared it would destroy us all." Poirot regarded her carefully, the silk scrap still in his hand. "Madame, perhaps your daughter is not lost, but hidden. Perhaps she has been silenced because she spoke too freely." Lady Evelyn swayed, pressing her hand to the mantel for support. "Then God help us all." At that moment the constable burst in, breathless, rain dripping from his cloak. In his hand he carried a small object wrapped in cloth. "Found near the Abbey ruins, sir," he panted. "Buried shallow in the mud. A knife." He unwrapped it, revealing a blade stained dark, the rust of years mingled with something fresher. Gasps echoed through the room. Miss Lorne scribbled furiously, her pen scratching like a dagger of its own. Dr. Ashworth muttered that it proved nothing. Crane's face drained of color. Lady Evelyn clutched her rosary. Poirot, however, remained calm. He examined the knife, noting its hilt engraved with worn initials, its edge dulled yet sharp enough to wound. He set it down with delicate precision. "A knife," he murmured. "Too neat, too theatrical. A red herring mis amos. For Lord Ferncombe, he did not die of knife wounds. This it is meant to distract, to mislead. Someone fears we are too close to truth." The rain lashed harder against the windows, as though the aisle itself conspired to heighten the dread. Poirot looked at each of them in turn, his voice steady, his gaze unflinching. "One of you placed this knife to lead us astray, and in doing so you have told me far more than you intended." The parlor fell silent, heavy with fear and falsehood. Clara was still missing, yet the trap was tightening. Poirot could feel it, as surely as he felt the storm pressing upon the manor walls. Chapter 4. Motive. Buried beneath the abbey, the morning broke heavy with fog. The isle cloaked so completely that sea and sky blurred into one pallid shroud. Blackthorn Manor stirred uneasily, the guests gathering in small clusters rather than in company, their whispers fraying with speculation. Yet Poirot had no appetite for parlor rumors this day. His eyes were set upon the abbey ruins, whose broken arches beckoned through the mist like skeletal fingers pointing toward truth. Accompanied by Inspector Howe, Poirot set out along the muddy path that wound from the manor to the ruins. The earth was sodden beneath their steps, sucking greedily at their boots, while the crows wheeled above, their cries harsh against the muffled silence. As the abbey came into view, its great nave open to the sky, its stones blackened with age, Poirot halted. He let the silence settle upon him, the whispers of centuries threading through the damp air. "Mon ami," Poirot said quietly, "it is not curses that haunt this place, but memory. And memory, it is often more dangerous than any superstition. The ruins bore evidence of recent trespass. Lantern soot stained the walls, footprints sank into the mud, and near the altar a patch of earth had been disturbed, its soil uneven, as though something had been buried and quickly retrieved. Poirot knelt, his gloved fingers brushing the clay. It was the same grit he had found upon the chapel floor. He rose, his eyes narrowing. Lord Ferncombe came here often. He dug not for faith, but for secrets. And secrets they are seldom buried alone. Within the sacristy they found more. She sank into a chair, her rosary clattering to the rug. "I went," she confessed faintly. "I went, yes, but not to kill him, to beg him, He was digging too deep, stirring whispers best left buried. I thought if he saw me in secret, if I could reach him without anger. She broke off, her face buried in her hands. But he would not listen. He laughed at me. Laughed. Clara's sob cut through the silence, but Poirot did not turn. His eyes moved to Lionel Crane, who sat rigid, his fists clenched on his knees. Monsieur Crane, you managed his debts. You knew his weakness for obsession, and you knew, too, that his ruin would ruin you. Did you not warn him? Did you not threaten him? Crane's head snapped up, his voice low but fierce. I advised, I pleaded, but he would not stop. He cared more for broken stones than for his estate, his family, his name. Yes, I stood in the Abbey ruins with him. I told him he was dragging us all into the sea. But I left him alive. Damn you. Alive. The parlor fell into a taut silence, broken only by the rain hissing against the windows. Poirot's gaze shifted once more, this time to Dr. Ashworth, who sat apart, his heavy shoulders bowed. And you, doctor, you examined the body. You saw the fear upon his face. You knew it was no heart alone that stopped. What truth do you withhold? Ashworth's hands shook. I gave him laudanum. Weeks ago. He could not sleep, his mind consumed. I feared he would break. But his voice cracked. But the dose he took was too great. It killed him. It must have killed him. Poirot's eyes narrowed. Yet the glass, it was shattered, not emptied. No, doctor, it was not an overdose alone. The brandy was laced, yes, but then staged. A locked door, a burned letter, a candle lit by an intruder. Someone wished it to appear a curse, to bury murder beneath legend. The guests shifted uneasily, each face pale in the lamplight. Poirot let the silence deepen, then continued, his tone low and steady. The Abbey, its relics, its whispers, they are not mere superstition. They are the stage. Lord Fern calm disturbed what should not be disturbed. And someone here, fearing exposure, fearing ruin, used that stage to disguise a killing as doom. He lifted the reliquary from the table, its tarnished surface catching the firelight. This Mies Amos is not a holy vessel. It is a mirror. In it you will see not saints nor curses, but yourselves, your greed, your fear, your lies. Lady Evelyn sobbed quietly. Crane stared at the floor. Ashworth's face crumpled with shame. Beatrice Lorne scribbled, her pen frantic. Clara clutched her blanket, whispering. It was her hand. I saw her hand. Poirot closed the reliquary with a snap. The Abbey has given us motive. Now only the unmasking remains. The fire flared, casting long shadows that stretched like accusing fingers across the parlor walls. Outside the fog pressed tighter, as though the aisle itself held its breath.